we convey for the doctoral thesis defense of Andrew Zarnke. The title of the thesis is the physiochemical characteristics of McIntyre powder and the impacts on cardiovascular disease among a cohort of Ontario underground mine workers. The candidate has worked under the supervision of Dr. Sandra Dorman. He will have 30 minutes to present a summary of his work. Then we will follow with public questions, if there are any. After the public question session, we will ask all attendees, except for the committee members and the candidate, to leave, and we will have a closed room oral examination questions. So now, Andrew, please, you can start your presentation.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? We all good? Sound check?
Yes, everything is okay.
Okay. Well, thanks everybody for being here today. I'm actually really excited to present my thesis for you today. So just a quick outline. I'll go over some of the history and background of McIntyre powder usage. Then I'll cover McIntyre powder and its potential contributions to cardiovascular disease risk and kind of why we decided to investigate this. Then I'll go over a brief summary of our physical and chemical characterization of McIntyre powder, as well as describe the incidence of cardiovascular disease in a cohort of mining workers exposed to McIntyre powder, which is an ultrafine aluminum powder in Ontario. So in 1926, silicosis became a compensable occupational disease. There were very high rates of silicosis in Ontario gold and uranium mines, primarily because of the high silica content in the ore that they were mining. In order to track the mine workers' health, they developed a mining master file. So each mine worker had a mine master card that followed them to every mine site that they worked in. It contained information on periods of employment, specific mine sites, ore type, job title, McIntyre powder exposure, pre-employment medical exams, and annual chest X-ray results. During the same time, McIntyre powder was developed by the McIntyre Research Foundation as a prophylaxis to silica exposure to decrease the occurrence of silicosis in the mines. So the official use of McIntyre powder started in 1943 at the McIntyre Porcupine Mine in Timmins, Ontario, and it continued till about 1980. The McIntyre powder treatment in Ontario was a mandatory treatment to work underground. The recommended dose by the McIntyre Research Foundation was 1 gram of powder per 1,000 cubic feet of locker room air for 10 minutes. And you can see here an image of what it looked like when they were dispensing the powder. This is an image actually at the Porcupine Mine, where the McIntyre powder was developed and designed. And this is a schematic of that same mine dry, or the locker room. And you can see in each corner here, aluminum blowers, where canisters of aluminum would be inserted and compressed air would be blown through to dispense the air. So just for an example, the amount of powder that would need to be used, this locker room was actually 80,000 cubic feet in volume. So that would mean that you would need 80 grams of McIntyre powder. Each canister was 10 grams of powder. So one person would dispense a canister at a time for 1 minute and go around the room. So it would take over 10 minutes to dispense enough McIntyre powder to achieve the dose that they recommended. And this was described by the workers as being not the greatest environment to be in before you would go underground in an already dusty environment. And you can see here in the schematic, they had doors that were designed to seal. They had shutters for the ventilation to close it off to ensure that this dose was achieved. So there have been 3 previous cohort studies investigating health effects of McIntyre powder. 2 in Ontario, which were focused primarily on neurological diseases, and 1 conducted in Australia, which included cardiovascular and cerebral vascular disease outcomes, as well as neurological conditions. The Western Australian gold miner study by Peters et al. In 2013 was the initial impetus to investigate McIntyre powder and its potential contribution to cardiovascular disease risk in a cohort of mine workers in Ontario. So they had a very similar design as the study I'm going to describe in this thesis. They had a mining master file. They used case definitions for cardiovascular disease. And they estimated standardized mortality ratios by comparing it to the general population in Australia. And they also did incident rate ratios or hazard ratios by comparing to the never exposed group, similar to the way we did in our study, which I'll get to soon. So it was very interesting, this study actually. So they also looked at the rates of pneumoconiosis, which include silicosis. And they were interested to see if McIntyre powder actually decreased the rate of silicosis or lung disease in miners in general. And you can see here, I hope you can see my cursor, but I'm highlighting this 19.6, SMR of 19.6 in the ever exposed to aluminum, and then the never exposed, which was 13.5. So you can see that it was actually higher in the aluminum exposed. So it did not decrease the rate of silicosis or pneumoconiosis as it's described here. If we look at cardiovascular disease, we see an increase in both ever exposed and never exposed. And there was no difference between, not much of a difference here, at least when you're comparing to the general population. But when we look at comparisons from like miners to miners, miners not exposed to miners exposed to McIntyre powder, we do see borderline significant increases in rate ratios in cardiovascular disease outcomes of about 23%, although the lower limit of the confidence interval goes below 1, but as you can see here, not by very much. When they considered the aluminum exposure as a continuous variable, you can see a significant result of about 2% per year of exposure. So this was very interesting, and it kind of was the impetus for us to look at why McIntyre powder would be contributing to cardiovascular disease. So this was the chapter 2 of my thesis, titled McIntyre powder and its potential contribution to cardiovascular disease risk, a lit review through the McIntyre historical lens, published in the American Journal of Industrial Medicine in June of 2022. So in 2018, the World Health Organization reported estimates of 7 million premature deaths per year caused by exposure to fine particulates. Fine particulates are described as particles below 2.5 micrometers in diameter, or also called PM 2.5. Lelyveld et al. In 2019 generated estimates that in 2015, there were 9 million deaths worldwide attributable to air pollution, with the strongest associations attributable to PM 2.5. So just to put this into perspective as a comparison, the World Health Organization also estimated the excess rate of death from tobacco smoking at 7.2 million per year. So just comparing those two numbers, you can see that PM 2.5 would be equal or greater risk of mortality. So the body of evidence supporting the association between particulate matter air pollution, or PM 2.5, and cardiovascular disease mortality has grown substantially over the years and has prompted several large literature reviews, scientific statements, and meta-analysis. The two most prominent and comprehensive reviews on this subject are Pope and Dockery in 2006 and the American Heart Association by Brooke and colleagues in 2010. There are two major landmark cohort-based mortality studies, the Harvard 6 Cities by Dockery and colleagues in 1993, with subsequent reanalysis in 2000 and 2006, and the American Cancer Society, initially published by Pope and colleagues in 1995. So I'm not going to go through each one of these, but this is a summary of the studies that have been done, primarily the Harvard 6 Cities and the American Cancer Society study. And just to generally point out that the most consistent and robust findings were for cardiopulmonary disease endpoints. And also to point out that these are increased relative risks of mortality per unit increase of 10 micrograms per meter cubed of PM2.5. So what are some of the factors that influence cardiovascular disease risk from inhaled particles? So larger particles, greater than 10 microns, they have a very high probability of being caught in the nasal passages and being filtered out very quickly. Smaller particles get deposited in the upper airways, and they land in something called a mucociliary escalator. And this allows the particles to be removed within hours, so relatively quickly. Particles that are below the 2.5 micrometers or PM2.5 have a higher probability of penetrating into the lower airways, into the alveolar sacs. So you can see these little balloon structures at the terminus of our airways are smooth, they're small, and these smaller particles have a much higher probability of reaching this area of the lung. So this is a smooth ciliated epithelium. Particle clearance is much slower at greater than 24 hours. So we just consider McIntyre powder in this scheme. If you're having McIntyre powder every single day before you go underground, you might still have particles from the day before if they're reaching this part of the lung. I also want to point out that this is where gas exchange occurs. So particles that reach this area of the lung have a higher probability of being translocated or actually penetrating through this epithelium and enter the circulatory system. You have a very close association with the vessels in this area. And the only form of particle clearance is actually immune cells called alveolar macrophages. And I put in a question here, lung overload. So all of this being said, it creates a situation where the particle clearance mechanisms can be overloaded. And lung overload happens when alveolar macrophages become overwhelmed with particles. The lung clearance is greatly reduced or even absent during lung overload. And smaller particles also accelerate the process of achieving lung overload. And ultrafine particles are more easily translocated from the lung through the circulatory system. So where does McIntyre powder fit into this? So this is some old dispersal data that we found in patents that were held by the McIntyre Research Foundation. And this is 8 minutes after dispersal of McIntyre powder. And you can see the units here are micrometers. It's not the proper logo, but it's micrometers. So we can see after 8 minutes, there was still 24% of the particulate was below 200 nanometers or 0.2 micrometers. So we knew before we had done our characterization that McIntyre powder was potentially a nanomaterial or a nanoparticulate. So the scientific evidence suggests that there's a dose-response relationship between PM2.5 and cardiovascular disease. The small particle sizes and high dose rate of McIntyre powder favor conditions for lung overload. These conditions provide an opportunity for McIntyre particles to translocate from the lung into the lymphatics, circulatory system, the heart, and other tissues in the body, like the brain. This inhibited lung clearance mechanism from McIntyre powder exposure would have likely enhanced the effects of subsequent dust exposure in underground, namely dust, radon, silica, diesel particulate exposures, and so on. So my thesis hypothesis was that the chemical and physical characteristics of McIntyre powder and the nature of McIntyre powder exposures will increase the risk of developing cardiovascular disease in a cohort of hard rock miners. This was broken down into two main aims or objectives: to measure the chemical and physical composition of McIntyre powder and to estimate the associations between McIntyre powder exposure and cardiovascular disease in a cohort of hard rock mine workers. So the first of this objective was chapter 3 of my thesis. It was published in the Journal of Occupational Environmental Hygiene, and it's the physical and chemical characterization of McIntyre powder. So first of all, we had two variations of McIntyre powder that we analyzed for mineralogical analysis and elemental composition. So we had a black variant of the powder All the miners described it being very black, but when we had canisters of it, we opened them and realized that there was a light gray version of the powder. The only sample of black powder that we knew of was in the Timmins Museum, National Exhibition Center in Timmins. So we went there and obtained samples of that for this analysis. For the light gray, we had 4 canisters that were donated by the United Steelworkers. All canisters were used, were reported to be recovered from various mine sites in Ontario that used McIntyre powder. So because of the limited amount of black powder, only light gray powder was analyzed for particle size. So the first particle size analysis we did was dynamic light scattering. Dynamic light scattering can measure the size of particles in an aqueous suspension by their Brownian motion, which is based on the principle that light particles will move faster, and the speed is directly related to their particle size. There are limitations to DLS analysis. When you're analyzing a sample that has a very large range in particle sizes, it tends to be skewed towards larger particles. The larger particles can obscure the light from smaller particles. So we decided to separate out the sample into 3 fractions. So we suspended an amount of McIntyre powder into water and then centrifuged it down for a short time. Then we extracted a sample of the supernatant, or the liquid suspension at the top here, and then a sample with a pipette from the top of the pelleted material, and then as well as from the bottom of the pelleted material. And you can see here on the figure that the supernatant had an average particle size of 132 nanometers, the top 327, and the bottom 638. The other really important characteristic that we gained from doing this was the surface charge of the particles, which was essential for knowing how to prepare the sample for the next analysis of atomic force microscopy. Atomic force microscopy allows us to image particles on a flat surface. So the sample of McIntyre powder was actually fixed to a flat surface of mica, which has a negatively charged surface. So you apply the sample to there, you treat it, and the particles are adhered to the surface of this mica. The atomic force microscopy, it's like a probe, and it basically scans across like a printer kind of thing. And it's got a very, very sensitive probe that goes along and measures the height and dimension of anything on the surface of this mica. Here's an example on the left of one of the images. And you can see by the scale bar that this is 1.5 microns. So this is actually an image of some of the very smallest McIntyre powder particles that we were able to image, of close to 5 nanometers in size. So just to put that into perspective, an alveolar macrophage is about 10 micrometers, and a single lipid molecule in one of our cells is close to that 5 nanometers in size. So we're looking at the size of a lipid molecule potentially. And after this analysis, the program takes all of these images and compiles them together and generates a count for each one of these particle size diameters. You can see that there is a substantial number of particles that are below the 20 nanometers in size. Next, we did transmission electron microscopy. There's 2 major reasons why we wanted to do TEM analysis. One was to, again, image some of the particles to look at the morphology and shape of them, but also to confirm that some of these small nanoparticulates were actually aluminum in composition, as opposed to some contaminant. So you can see the image on the right, C, shows the crystallographical planes, and it allows you to measure these and compare them to a known crystallograph planes for aluminum. You can see just by a crude comparison that it's very, very similar. So we were happy to see that we could confirm that these particles were in fact aluminum. So the first kind of chemical or mineralogical analysis we did was X-ray diffraction. It can measure the presence of different forms of aluminum minerals based on their crystal structure. Both the light and gray variations of powder were predominantly composed of aluminum hydroxide in the form of bayerite and gibbsite, which both have the same chemical formula, AlOH3. The black powder also had a higher proportion of pure aluminum metal compared to the light gray powder. The next analysis we did was elemental assays. So we did 3 different types of elemental assays depending on the detection limits of each analysis and the corresponding concentration of each element. First of all, we did aluminum, and we saw that there was more aluminum in the black powder, which was consistent with our XRD analysis. We also saw a 50% increase in iron and a 2 times amount of manganese in the black powder and almost 10 times the amount of zinc in the black powder. I just want to point out that a single weight percent is 10,000 ppm. So even this next highest concentration of iron is, a 0.1% of the total weight. So it was very interesting to see what these trace elements were and where the potential contaminants were. But again, these are all basically the sample is digested completely with a strong acid. So all of these contaminants, they could have been in solid solution within the particles rather than standalone, say, bioavailable versions of this. But we felt it was important to potentially understand what contaminants could have been present. So chapter 3 conclusions. So the McIntyre powder is 100% below 2.5 microns in diameter. So it is a PM 2.5. There are a substantial proportion of McIntyre powder particles that were below 100 nanometers. And both variations of McIntyre powder were predominantly aluminum hydroxide. So chapter 4 describes the incidence of cardiovascular disease in a cohort of mine workers exposed to ultrafine aluminum powder. So the first thing we had to do was link the miners in the mining master file to the registered persons database. This allows us to obtain health card numbers, which allows us to draw the linkage to the Ontario health databases to ascertain cases of cardiovascular disease. There was 3 databases, the discharge abstract database, which contains information about hospital visits, the Ontario Health Insurance Plan claims database, which holds information about physician billing in Ontario, and the National Ambulatory Care Reporting System, or NACRS, which holds information about emergency room visits as well as other outpatient information. The next thing we had to do was establish strong validated case definitions. Case definitions consist of the ICD-9 codes that are coded in the databases I just described, as well as time information, and kind of generates an algorithm for identifying an actual case of that disease outcome. So we decided we wanted to look at ischemic heart disease, which was a broader diagnostic category, which included the other 3, acute myocardial infarction or heart attack, congestive heart failure, which was kind of more of a more severe end of life kind of diagnostic category, and then strokes and transient ischemic attacks, because we were interested in further looking at the cerebral vascular impacts as well, potentially. And I put the references here simply because I wanted to show that these were all previously published and validated case definitions, which was really great for the feasibility of this study. It allowed us to know what all the parameters and different factors involved with the sensitivity and the probability of detecting a case or not detecting a case. So here's the flow chart just describing all these steps of the linkage that ended up with our cohort studies, or study cohorts. So the mining master file has 93,000 people in it. And then we lost a certain number of people because of duplicate records. And the main one was 46,000 people were lost due to no health card number matched in the registered persons database. Then when we link to the administrative health databases, we lose a lot of people to follow up. So if someone died before the year 2006 was when we had the administrative health data available, they would not be found in our cohort. So we lost about 11,000 people depending on the outcome. And you can see at the bottom, we have about 25,813 for depending on which disease outcome you look at. So then we had to also assess McIntyre powder exposure. So there was two sources of McIntyre powder exposure. One was from self-reported exposure on annual medical exams. And the second was the actual work history on each of the mine master cards compared to a list of 51 mine sites that use McIntyre powder for a specific period of time. Here's an example of one of the original. This is actually, I believe that's Janice's father, but she's probably going to correct me at the end of this. But you can see it's hard to read, but oh yeah, it says his name right at the top. Each one of the jobs he had and the date, the job title, where he worked, and then there's this little column that's really fuzzy, but it says alum dot yes or no. And then there was these X-ray results that are coded that I don't know what all the codes mean, but that's an example of what they look like. So here's just an overview of a comparison of the two different exposure assessment approaches, self-reports and historical records. And you can see that there is a slightly larger proportion of exposed workers with the historical exposure assessment. And then I'll briefly describe, so we also decided to stratify our analysis by the year 1956. So 1956 was a significant date where the method of manufacturing McIntyre powder changed. And they tried to optimize the manufacturing of McIntyre powder to be much smaller in particle size. So we thought it would be interesting to see if there was a more robust or more significant result looking at only people exposed to McIntyre powder after 1956. And then for the general accumulative duration categories, we went with greater than 0 or 1 year of exposure, 1 to 5 years, 5 to 10 years, 10 to 20 years, and then greater than 20 years. So I'm just going to show the results for the historical records exposure assessment approach. And we'll start with where we did not see significant results, where we did not see any meaningful results with stroke or transient ischemic attacks. But we did see when we compare not exposed to exposed, you can see that across the board, there's a 9% increase, 14% increase, and 10% increase, where the bottom of the confidence interval did not cross 1. And then when we look at the greater than 10 years to 20 years for myocardial infarction or heart attacks, we see a significant result of about 20% increase. And although this is below 1. Here we start to see a signal here in congestive heart failure. And then in the greater than 20 years of exposure, we see a significant result for ischemic heart disease at 37% and about 60% for acute myocardial infarction, and close to 60% for congestive heart failure as well. We did not see any meaningful difference in these results when we looked at stratifying by the year 1956. So just to quickly summarize all the results for this chapter. So McIntyre exposure compared to never exposed had about a 10% increased risk of ischemic heart disease, heart attack, and congestive heart failure. Mine workers with 10 to 20 years of exposure had about 20 to 30% increased risk of heart attack and 14 to 23% increased risk of congestive heart failure. Mine workers with greater than 20 years of exposure had a 50 to 60% increased risk of heart attack and a 60 to 70% increased risk of congestive heart failure. And it seemed that these rates of increased with the duration of exposure. So the physical and chemical characterization of McIntyre powder revealed substantial fractions of aluminum nanoparticles. It was confirmed that 100% of McIntyre particulates were less than 2.5 microns in diameter. This supported our hypothesis that McIntyre particle size distribution was small enough to allow for particle translocation into the circulatory system, allowing opportunity for further effects in the vascular and cardiac tissue after exposure. The retrospective cohort study conducted in this thesis found McIntyre exposed mine workers had a higher incidence of ischemic heart disease, heart attack, and congestive heart failure when compared to not exposed Ontario mine workers. The findings in this dissertation supported our hypothesis that McIntyre powder exposed mine workers were at increased risk for cardiovascular disease. So thank you very much. I would be happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Andrew, for this presentation. Does anyone from the audience have any question for Andrew? So we can take a few questions before we move to in-camera oral examination. Any questions? If you have a question, please, you can open your mic and ask it directly to Andrew. Or if you want, you can ask it in the chat. I would be more than happy to read it for everyone. Any questions or comments? Okay, it looks like no one wants to comment or to ask any questions. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending this presentation. Okay, we have a question from Sarah. Yeah, please go ahead.
Hi, everybody, and thanks, Andrew, for your presentation. Wonderful job. Such an awesome thing to see all of your work in one place. I just had one question around I think that I'm more familiar with the later parts of your work, more in the ODSS analysis, but the earlier parts are kind of new to me still. So I just had a question around with the lab work and the work that you were doing, if you had any particular challenges that arise. It's more a question of curiosity, if there were certain things that you came up against that you had to troubleshoot, or yeah, if there was anything like that came up and how you sort of handled that in the lab space. So it's more of a question of curiosity, but I'll leave that to you.
Yeah, yeah, I guess it would just be that I really kind of wished we would have pursued a more comprehensive particle size distribution. And it was interesting, within about 6 or 8 months after we published our paper, Dr. Verma published a more comprehensive particle count, total particle count for using TEM analysis. Myself had very limited access to TEM, but we were able to get what we did. So I guess that would be my only hiccup, that I wished we could have filled there. But someone else came along very quickly and did anyway, so we were able to consider that in our work anyway. So But
And
thanks.
Dr. Verma, he's still at McMaster. Is that true?
I think, but I'm,
Okay.
Okay. Thank you
Okay,
so much.
thank
We have a
you.
few more
Thank you.
questions. Let me go with Christine.
A very good presentation, Andrew. And I think this is really very important work. And just from a medical perspective, looking at the 3 cardiovascular outcomes for which there was statistical significance, the ischemic heart disease, myocardial infarction, and congestive heart failure. It might be interesting at some point in the future to go back and see if you can tease out interrelationships between the 3, because I think the bottom line is sort of driver is ischemic heart disease, and then myocardial infarction follows from that. But from a medical perspective, the congestive heart failure is particularly interesting because ischemic heart disease can cause congestive heart failure, but there are a lot of other factors that can contribute to congestive heart failure. So I think it might be interesting going forward to look a little bit more carefully at congestive heart failure. For example, hypertension without ischemic heart disease necessarily could contribute to congestive heart failure. And there are lots of other factors that can as well. So I think that might be a fruitful area of investigation going forward.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Okay. Kevin.
Yeah, hi Andrew. Amazing work. Like how you fit so much into your thesis. It's incredible, honestly. But I was just had a thought about PM 2.5. There seems to be a real focus on PM 2.5, and it seems that what you found, most of the particles were PM1. And I'm just thinking, moving forward, I think, looking at exposures from an environmental perspective, there should be more attention on PM1. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that as well. Thanks.
Yeah, there was a bit of attention focused on PM 2.5 simply because that's what's out there in the literature, and I wanted to be able to draw comparisons to the current literature. But yeah, of course, I definitely agree. When you look at the physiology of our bodies and how they respond to particulates, I think there needs to be more focus on the PM1 or even in the nanoparticulate size range. And I think our analytical limits are being challenged with the nanoparticulates to properly estimate exposure to those types of things. So I think it's something that needs to be addressed in future research for sure. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Janice.
Hi. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to ask Andrew, first of all, it was an amazing presentation. Of course, I'm quite invested in this. And I'm not even sure if you can answer this question, but I know some of my McIntyre powder project mine workers either had very early heart attacks or died like in their 40s and 50s or whatever from heart related issues. And with your presentation, it was saying, seemed to be like a much longer period of time that they would have to be exposed to McIntyre powder for that to be statistically significant. What I'm wondering is if you would know whether if somebody had more vulnerability to that, similar to like an immune reaction where they only have because of their genetics or whatever, if it's possible that somebody could have a lower dose of McIntyre powder and still see a related elevated risk. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, I think with the data we have, it would be hard to do that. But I think further refinement of our case definitions could potentially try and tease out some of those things potentially. Also, having a longer period For follow-up, disease follow-up, we only had from 2006 to 2018. So we are losing people that would have died before 2006. So that could also help understand more of the age-related things if we had a wider span of disease follow-up.
Mortality.
Okay, thank you. We'll take a last comment from Christine before. Are you good? Okay.
Just a thought, you know, you've got a lot of exposure data there. And at some point in the future, just thinking about what Janet said, it would be interesting to look at possibly constructing a dose response relationship, because for heart attacks, let's say, you know, you might, depending on the dose response relationship, that might explain why you would see ischemic heart disease or myocardial infarction death at a younger age and shorter duration than you would expect. That's all.
Okay. So thank you everyone for attending this presentation. Actually, we had a very big crowd today. So Andrew should be very happy with that. So we'll ask everyone else to leave the meeting except for the committee.